Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me as we talk to today's guest. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Sarah Langslow to the show. Sarah is an executive coach, leadership development specialist, and a seasoned writer on the nuances of leading with both power and humanity. She has over 2 decades of experience in building leadership skills, a unique perspective shaped by her background as a competitive rower, and more than 3,000 hours of coaching senior leaders. Sarah is a sought-after advisor in the world of leadership. She holds an MA and an MBA from the University of Cambridge and is a professional certified coach, accredited by the International Coaching Federation. Sarah is also the author of Do Sweat the Small Stuff, a book that highlights the critical importance of micro-interactions in effective leadership, and we're definitely going to be talking more about that today. Sarah, we're delighted to have you with us today. A very big welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So tell us, what is a micro-interaction and what does it matter for leadership?
Yeah, it's a good foundational point to start on, right? So the way I define micro interactions is that they are the moments of connection that we have with other humans that occur in their multitudes every single day. So it's every tiny interaction we have with other people. So it could be what we say, could be when and how we say things, which also influences the interaction. It could be what we choose not to say, where we stay silent. It could be what we listen to, what we ignore. And of course, this is not only verbal communication, but online. What are the Slack messages that we respond to quickly, or the emails that we sit on for weeks, or the ones that get a very quick response? But it goes beyond our sort of actual communications in terms of speaking and listening. And it is also, our micro interactions also encompass what we do, how we act, our habits, our behaviors, some of which are, of course, shaped and influenced by our emotions. And in some ways, it's our very sort of presence and impact, which, all of that adds up to that through these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tiny little interactions we have with people every day. And the reason I think they're important is because I think they're often overlooked. Quite a lot of these kind of interactions tend to happen almost on autopilot. They happen through habit. They happen without us particularly thinking about them or putting much intention into them, or necessarily being aware of the impact we're having through them, which means there's this whole raft of communication going on, verbal and non-verbal, that we're not really thinking about. And as leaders, I think it's a part that we actually can't really afford to ignore.
So I'm guessing the level of micro that we are talking about, one of the most difficult things is that I might interpret it in one way, but you might interpret something in a different way. And then the other 5 people that are in the meeting will hear something, feel something, sense something different. How do we, as leaders, even begin to understand all of those different responses that people are having to us so that we can make those decisions of how do we want to behave?
It's a great question, because you're right. As human beings, we're all meaning-making machines, if you like. We take things that happen to us or that are said to us or that we read or see or observe, and we add meaning to them. So one thing to be very clear on is we can't control that. This is not about trying to control exactly how others respond. But what we can do is begin to dial up our awareness and begin to notice the impact of things. So rather than just breezing through, rather than just not thinking about it at all, we can start to have an awareness of how things land. Does it generate some unusual looks on people's faces? Are there times when we hear silence, when we're curious why there might not be an answer? Even the act of being curious and going, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I thought we might get some conversation after that, and we didn't. I wonder what happened. So that's the kind of areas where we can begin to notice. And one of the core themes through the book is that there's no right and wrong. There's no right way to interact. There's no wrong way to interact. And even in any given situation, conversation with any particular person, there's also no right and wrong. that might be more or less effective depending on what we're trying to achieve at that time, or depending on the relationship we're trying to build, or whatever we're trying to do through that interaction. But it's not about right and wrong. And so a lot of this is about practice and experimentation and curiosity and being willing to go beyond what might be our habitual ways of interacting and being with people, where we're not really thinking, and kind of just picking up when maybe something's not quite working, being curious, being willing to try something different. As I say, if we're not doing that in search of a kind of right answer, that in a way frees us up, because it's saying, look, we can be clear on the kind of impact we want to have, or the kind of result that we're trying to get through an interaction or a set of interactions. But there are lots of different ways to get there. But we have to be willing to go beyond what's habitual and normal, to experiment, to see if there might be better ways.
So, as far as you're concerned, where does self-awareness fit in this definition? And I'm interested in your answer, because for me, the definition of self-awareness and self-aware leadership is reflection, recognition, and regulation. So it is about that, making sure that you understand how you are received and perceived, and then making choices about how you want to be received and perceived, and changing your behavior. So where does self-awareness fit for you?
It's very strongly aligned to that, I would say, because for me, it's about understanding the impact we're seeking to have as a leader. Like, what do we want? What kind of leader do we want to be? What do we want to be known for? What's important to us? What are our values and beliefs? What does success mean to us as a leader? And how do we build our relationships and hold our conversations and have all of our interactions that, as far as possible, align with that? It's never going to be perfect. But the awareness is the bit for me which links our intention and our impact, and allows us to sort of iterate and feed back on that and learn and adjust and, as you say, recognize and adapt where the impact we're seeking to have isn't in fact the impact we're having. But without any self-awareness, or without a willingness to be curious about that, we'll never know, right? We'll just breeze through the world and going, everything's fine, everybody's great. That's where the self-awareness piece comes in for me.
In your experience, what are the common blind spots that you're seeing that leaders are having? And I guess it's almost the $64 million question, that if you tell me what my blind spots are, then I can go and fix them. But of course, everybody has different ones. But what are you seeing are the common ones?
I think the hard question to answer, because on one level, it's obviously, as you say, different for everybody. But I think one of the commonest areas where people get tripped up or get stuck is forgetting like all of the interactions that actually happen around what they say. So it's like, well, I said this, or I communicated this. Was that not clear? And they don't understand why the behaviors or the actions or the things that follow don't actually align with what they say, or people go and do something else entirely. There's a great example of this, which I talk about in the book, which is this idea of being busy. So you have those leaders who say, I want to be there for my team. I want to be available. I want to support you, to coach you. My door is always open. That old chestnut. Now, that leader can say that until they're blue in the face. If their calendar is booked wall to wall with meetings all day, if that same leader in this world of hybrid working is almost never seen in the office to be caught for perhaps an informal conversation, if that same leader in every conversation they have starts it with an undertone of, gosh, I'm so busy, you should see my to-do list at the moment, wow, I'm absolutely flat out at the moment. All of those interactions, their calendar is a form of interaction because the team can see it. Or if they're 5 minutes late to every meeting, reinforcing a sort of, oh, I'm flat out, I'm so busy, I've got so much to do. All of that is sending a completely contrary message to the, my door is always open, I'd like to talk to you. In fact, that is probably sending a set of messages saying, I'm really busy, leave me alone, I don't have time for you. I know I say my door is always open, but I'd really rather you didn't come through it because frankly, I've got too much else to do. And I think that incongruence, as I talk about it, between what we say and then how we act, or the other, sometimes subtle, sometimes not very subtle messages that we give off through our behaviors and indeed our other communications, that's a place where it gets missed. or where leaders find that they're missing their teams, and they're like, why does my team never ask me for, they've been struggling with this, or they didn't tell me about this problem, or they didn't. It's like, well, are you actually creating time to see them? Are you actually available? Or do you just say it, but then everything else you say doesn't back that up?
Oh, I love that. So the seventh direction of my self-awareness compass is behavior, and essentially it's about modeling behavior. And that's exactly what you're saying there. It's that you've got to talk the talk and walk the walk, because if you're saying one thing, but you're behaving, or the tone of voice or the diary doesn't live that, you've got that incongruence, haven't you? And yes, absolutely. I love that description. It's so real. And you do see that. Something that somebody said to me in my research was that they had a line manager who very rarely came into the office, and was then really surprised when their direct reports were hardly there, and they got quite annoyed about it. It's interesting, isn't it? People don't get it. They don't see that.
And I think there's even simpler examples. I had one client who used to despair that their team would never ask them for help. And she had definitely trained them that she was very busy. But the other thing that she would do is, so at the end of meetings, she would leave literally in the last 30 seconds of a meeting. She would sort of be like, any questions? Anybody? Any questions? Okay, great. I'll leave you to it. I was like, right. Or even worse than that, sometimes did everybody understand? It takes a really brave person to go, actually, no. When there's 30 seconds left, your leader's busy, they've got other, of course they're all going to say yes. And then they all go away, not really understanding, or in fact did have questions. And so the simple act of her working on how she facilitates those meetings, of leaving 10 minutes at the end for questions, of saying, what questions do you have for me? Rather than, does anybody have any questions? Like, it's a tiny tweak in language, but it sets an expectation that there are questions, and that's fine. Alongside oh, by the way, there's 10 minutes left of this meeting, sets a tone of, this is important. I want you to ask me questions. I want to be here to help. I want to, I've intentionally left this time and space to give you support. And so, even in that sort of micro way, can be the difference between, does your team disappear off and not really understand what they're doing and go and try and figure it out on their own, and then only really let you know when it's too late, which was very much her pattern, or do they actually get the support they need up front?
That very subtle nuance between closed question and open question has such huge implications, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it makes
amazing.
Just changes the tone and the whole intent behind the question is actually different.
Definitely. And I'm just thinking, I've got a team meeting tomorrow. I'm going to ask that question at the end, as I often do. I'm going to ask it differently. Something that I'm interested in is, how are leaders able to balance this need to tune in, reflect on the responses and the impact that they're having on others, whilst doing the work and the to-do work of the to-do list, I guess. And it's something that has become a topic of conversation with healthcare leaders, because often they are so busy doing the do that they don't have reflection time. And that is a big issue, whether you're clinical, whether you're management. What are your thoughts around finding that space?
It's a really tough question, and you're right. I think it's one that rears its head for a lot of people. It's one where I think the answer I tend to give, lots of people don't like, and can at times feel unrealistic, but it does come back to what you prioritize. And we have to be willing to me, it's never about finding the time, but it's about creating the time. Because if you look to try and find it, everything else will fill the time available. But if you know if your listeners have come across the Eisenhower matrix, which is the urgent versus important, it's a 2x2 quadrant of urgent, not urgent, important, not urgent, not important. A lot of this reflection sits in the quadrant that is important, but it's not urgent. It will never be urgent. Virtually never, never quite say never. It just doesn't fit into it. But yet the stuff that sits in that area, important but not urgent, it's the activities that give us the long-term return. They give us the bigger return on our investment on time. And we have to make the time. We have to create it. We have to set it aside by prioritizing it. the thing I always say that sits alongside that is for leaders is to be willing to tolerate like a little bit of mess, because the result of that is something will fall by the side, like something will not get done. I had one client who said, I just gave up inbox zero because I wanted to. I absolutely wanted to. And it was incredibly hard to do. But there were other things that were more important. And I realized that if an email was really important and I missed it, somebody would email me again or would call me. And she trained her team of different ways of communicating with her, of different ways of getting in touch with her for things, of providing reminders where she needed them, rather than relying that she would always go to the end of her inbox every single day. And, that freed up time for her because there was a chunk of time spent doing that. She had to let something go. In other words, something has to give. But if we relate to the reflection time and the self-learning and the curiosity about ourselves as important and ultimately as valuable as it is, that's where we actually create the time by making it a priority, I think. I guess the other argument I always have with it is reflection time. The thing for me that it is leading to in a leadership perspective is ultimately it's about enhanced performance of your team, because you're figuring out how to get the best out of yourself so as to get the best out of others. And so the time you spend on self-reflection is often something that magnifies, because it's not just you that it impacts, it's those around you and how you work and how they work and the skills and capability they might build. And so while it might not be an immediate return, it might not make your day to day or tomorrow or next week more efficient and effective. In the short term, it may create some mess because something else has got to give. In the longer term, it's actually what makes the difference, or can help to make the difference if you're then acting on what you learned from reflecting.
That real thinking time. There was something you mentioned there, and I'm hearing this as it feels like the new management buzzword, inbox zero.
Yes.
What is inbox zero?
So inbox zero is where you effectively clear your inbox at the end of every day. So there is nothing left unaddressed or not dealt with. Just for clarity on that, you get people who are very strong proponents of it and are very keen and like, no, I want this clean, I want this. And then you get people like me who are very much not that and have different ways of managing their inbox. My view was always that if you are doing that, you are managing your life to somebody else's priorities, because I can't control who sends me email and when. What I can do is control how I manage my inbox and when I spend my time and invest time and prioritize on it. But if there are tons of emails in there which probably never need to be read or dealt with by me. So yes, that's what inbox zero is.
So it's something new to think about, leaders and managers out there.
Absolutely.
In your book, you invite leaders to answer this question, which is, who are you as a leader? Where do you begin to help leaders answer that question? Because I quite like asking it, and I sometimes ask it in job interviews, usually when I'm the little person sitting on the other side of the desk. And often I get blank faces and I get 30 seconds of tumbleweeds rolling by whilst people are thinking about it. How do you find people manage to answer that question?
I mean, I think that's a good point. I think that's a really tough interview question, because for me, this is one of those questions that you sort of plant in the back of your head and let it marinate for a while. It's a really tough one to answer sort of on the spot if it's not something you've thought about before. So I think it's one that you can, it's one to use reflection time on. I think there are also some quite structured ways, and again, I've made some suggestions in the book about how you might approach this. The two I would quite like to highlight. So one of which is to imagine there was a documentary crew following you around for a week. To kind of access all areas. Like,
Okay.
no, nothing is off limits. They can see how you behave with other people. They can see how you spend your time, what you prioritize, maybe how you make decisions. What the balance of how you approach different problems or challenges or people or situations. And it's to think for that sort of impartial observer, and I realize they're never completely impartial, but for that impartial observer, what would they say? Like, how would they, what would they say about who you are? What would they say about what's important to you? How might they describe you? What words might they use? What would they say you do or don't care about as a leader? It's not a complete answer, but it's a way of sort of sometimes separating ourselves and looking in from the outside and thinking, well, what would somebody say? You know, if I look at my diary and I look at how I spend my time, what message does that send? You know, how do I behave with others? What might the fly on the wall say? The parallel question is sometimes to think about, it's an interesting one, is to think about what frustrates you about your team. So if you're sort of sitting there and think, oh, it drives me mad when X does this, or I really wish they wouldn't do that, or oh, here they go again, you know, they've done this again, or why do they never, you know, those sort of the little complaints that, let's be honest, we kind of all have. We may never voice them, and that's great, but they sort of noodle around in our head, and there's the level of, oh, I wish they would. If we flip that round and say, how did my behavior cause that to happen? You know, what did I do or not do that caused it to go that way? Again, that's another place where we can get signals about how we behave as a leader, what impact our actions may be having, perhaps where the gaps might be in terms of, you know, who we actually are versus who we might want to be, because that is, of course, the second part of that question, which is equally important. It's not only who are you as a leader, but who do you want to be as a leader? Because closing that gap is kind of really the core of it. But it gives us hints to where there is a gap, to where we think, oh, actually, I'm doing this, but maybe I could be doing this because that's the impact I want to have, and I can be responsible for that element of my team's behavior. So, you know, to go back to the example of being busy, to say, well, actually, do I prioritize my one-to-one meetings, for example? How do I talk about them? How do I behave in them? Do I turn them into a glorified task management thing about what's on someone's to-do list for that week? Or do I actually create some time to talk about them, what they're facing, what challenges they're having, what skills they might want to build, what support they might need from me? You know, that can be that's that sort of where that reflection process could lead, if you like. You know, my team member's not doing this. Oh, how might I? Well, I haven't had a one-to-one with them for 6 weeks because I keep cancelling it because I'm so busy. What if I? So that's where we start to. It's one area where we can start to understand our impact a little bit more in terms of who we currently are.
Oh, Sarah, you really made me think now. There were a couple of things that I thought I'm going to do things differently tomorrow because of what you said today. Yes, definitely. That separation and helicopter view to give you that understanding of your impact on others and that micro impact that you have or don't have. If you think about where you want to go, what's your end goal here, that definitely does change the way you think about how you operate and how you communicate, how you behave to get there. And I really like that. I think that some people are definitely better than others at thinking about, by the time I get to the end of this meeting, I want to have achieved X, but lots of people are in it and they're thinking on their feet. So I think that's a real challenge, isn't it?
I think it's both. It's one of the reasons in the book, the sort of foundational part for making any changes to the way we interact starts with who do we want to be as a leader, because it's really easy to get overwhelmed by this, right? When you actually start laying it out and you think about the number of interactions you have, the number of emails you send, the number of little conversations you have, or different parts to any given conversation, you know, each question you ask, if you think about them individually, that's sort of brain melting territory. It's incredibly hard to do. But if we're starting with that, with a sort of higher level definition of the kind of person, the kind of leader we want to be, which is also the kind of person we want to be, which might be our values, our beliefs and assumptions, what's really important to us, our goals, our version or our vision for success. If we're committing to that and saying, right, as far as I can, I want to be working towards that all the time, then you can start to break it down and say, okay, well, what does that mean in this meeting? Okay, maybe the predictable thing for me in this meeting is, again, to use the same example, I'm really busy. I just want to get through it as fast as possible. Let's just get this over with and get out the door or get off the Zoom meeting. If one of our values, say, as a leader is around developing others or around being generous with our time and attention or around supporting others, I don't know, you know, whatever it is, if we have a value or something that's really important to us, or it could be in the form of a belief or an assumption of saying, well, actually, my team's success is my success. Then we might start the meeting and say, well, actually, this isn't about getting it done as fast as possible. This is about how do I run this meeting in a way that my team learns the most? What does that look like? And in each interaction, oh, wait, I can pause myself and say, no, I'm not just going to immediately give them my top of the head answer because that's the quick thing to do. I'm going to say, okay, what are your ideas on that? Look, sure, I have some and I'm willing to put them in, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts first, right? It can be as simple as that in that moment. But if we have that vision of who we want to be and how we want to behave and the kind of leader we want to be, we can then break that down in each day, in each meeting, in each interaction. And we won't be perfect. This is not about being perfect. But the more we can stay present to that and be thinking and slow down a fraction just so we can interrupt our automatic way of doing it, just get out the door, I'm busy, and into, no, I'm going to pause and I'm going to ask a question instead of just solving this problem.
Listeners and watchers, there are some really good questions that Sarah's shared throughout the podcast so far. There is a transcript. You might want to go back and read through it just so that you can pick up those questions, but there'll also be a link to Sarah's book in the show notes as well. What happens if you're a leader who is new to this? It's something that you want to do because it's something you know will help your professional growth. But if it's something that's new to you, where do you start when it's a bit fearful? Because feedback can be pretty nasty unless you're careful and you ask the right people. Where do you start?
Yeah, another great question. I think a few things I say. One is you just have to start. There's always that myth that it'll be better when, or I'll feel comfortable if, or well, I'll wait until this. We've got to start. Now, if you're feeling uncomfortable with it, you probably start with the inner reflection first. You might not start by going and asking absolutely everybody for feedback, for example. That might be a tough beginning. I think that probably the biggest piece of advice I would give when starting that self-reflection, if it's something you're a bit wary of or a bit uncomfortable about, is as far as we can to try and reflect from a place of curiosity, not from judgment. It's very easy to get, as we start thinking about our behavior and reflecting back, like say we decide to reflect for a few minutes on a meeting that maybe hasn't gone as well as we hoped. It's very easy to jump into a kind of, well, what did I do wrong? Where did I mess up? Oh, I did that terribly. Oh, that was embarrassing when I said that. Or, oh, I really shouldn't have done that. All of that is in a place of judgment and is coming from a sort of, I was bad, I was wrong, I messed up version of that. If we can, through an awareness of our tendency to do that, we can actively nudge ourselves towards curiosity, which is simply asking things like, what could I have done differently? Or I wonder why that landed that way. Or how might I think about this differently for next time? Or what options would I have for preparing differently that might lead to a different outcome? Or, if we feel like asking feedback, great, but we can do a lot of that through self-reflection just from being curious. And especially because with lots of these, it's not like there's a single answer. This happened because of X. It can just be, oh, well, what if I tried that next time? Not from, I did it wrong this time, I am bad, just from, oh, that didn't work very well. Why don't I try something different? So that coming from curiosity can lower the stakes almost. So it doesn't feel like we're starting a process where we'll just highlight all of our flaws. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of understanding our strengths and weaknesses, but I think sometimes it leads us into a conversation where all we look for is weaknesses because we tend to be very bad at acknowledging strengths. So if we actually just almost make it neutral and say, well, it's just a set of things I did, some of which worked well and some of which didn't. Okay, great. What can I learn from that? What can I be curious about that?
So really leaning into that growth mindset and probably learning about a fixed mindset and actually that you have a choice that you can move from fixed to growth and that helps you move into that space of curiosity.
Yeah, and it's also the piece which very much relates to confirmation bias in the sense that if our mindset is telling us that we think we might have done something wrong or we're sort of judging ourselves for where we've got things wrong, then we look for evidence of that. So when we're reflecting back on a meeting or, whatever it might be, we're reflecting on our week, we look for all the instances that match all the evidence that fits our story. If our story of, I haven't been a good week, I've not led this team very well, whatever it is, we'll just find all the evidence for that. Whereas, so if we can take the confirmation bias out of it, if you like, so we're not looking for that, so we're just curious. It's just, yeah, I'm just interested in what happened to see what I can learn from it.
Something I'm interested in is microaggressions, microincivility, and maybe listeners will be more familiar with those terms than microinteractions. What are your thoughts, experiences, or words of advice for our listeners and watchers who are in a position where they are noticing microaggressions, microincivilities, and often they are so micro, it's very difficult to explain them to somebody else?
Yeah, I would preface this by saying I'm not a DEIB expert. So this is very much from my personal experience and where that interacts. I think.
What's DEIB?
Sorry, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So I'm not an expert in that space, which is often where particularly the microaggressions conversation can emerge. But what I would say is a couple of elements to this. I think coming from the leader's perspective, one of the biggest things we need to be aware of is the power dynamic that is in any space. Now, what I mean by that is if you are a team leader of any, whether you're anything from CEO of an organization down to simply a manager responsible for a team, when you are interacting between those different levels, between a manager and their team, there is a power dynamic in place because you as the manager, as the leader, have at least to some extent, the power to reward or punish. And, power dynamics power can exist in many forms. Sometimes that's a literal, I can give someone a bad performance review, or I can give them opportunities. Sometimes you can even just have power, not even through authority, simply because you're a more confident person, or you know more senior level people in the organization, so you have relational power. There's all sorts of different power. If there are power dynamics in the space, we have to be sort of extra aware of how we interact because they will impact it. They will impact whether people feel safe to speak up, whether people feel safe to give us feedback, how they respond, but also the level of importance they place on what we say and do and how we act. So there's like an extra level of significance because of the power. And I think where this interacts particularly with microaggressions and microincivilities is understanding that we might think something is completely neutral, unimportant. It's like a throwaway comment or something absolutely teeny tiny. But to the person who is hearing it on the receiving end, the power magnifies the significance of that. It magnifies the impact of it. And so, for me, it comes back to self-awareness, but it also links to that curiosity and a real willingness to hear and be open to feedback. Because, and sometimes to do that, we have to be able to create space to hear that, not rely on, someone will come and tell me if. There was a post on LinkedIn I saw the other day of someone basically saying, one-to-ones are pointless. They've lost, we have far too many of them. Like, well, we don't need them very often. And it got me thinking about it because it's like, well, is it that the one-to-ones are pointless or is it that the way they're being run is ineffective? I would probably argue the latter. Because, for example, one-to-ones, that one-to-one time and space goes far beyond what you might actually discuss in a one-to-one meeting. It is a demonstration of your commitment to be with and listen to that person, to build a relationship.
Yeah, I agree.
It creates time and space to hear feedback. And you might not hear it in the first one, the second one, the fifth one, the 10th time, the 20th one. But if you are consistently providing space and showing an openness to hear feedback and then responding positively and effectively when you do, you're much more likely to understand those things that you miss, the microaggressions or the microincivilities that you're not even picking up on. But you create that space with your team, that safety, that trust that they can reflect these things back to you, and you can seek feedback from others. It's if you're open to and hearing feedback from other people as well is also an important part of it. When you layer on the power dynamics and the micro interactions and how that all connects up to microaggressions and microincivilities, it comes back to self-awareness, but it probably goes a step beyond. And how are you creating the space where you will hear the feedback about this, because they might be things that you are genuinely unaware of, you know?
Yes. And that, I guess it's that big blind spot, isn't it, that we all want to uncover and understand, yet we don't want to be emotionally wounded and hurt by it either. So it's a tricky business, isn't it? I really liked your phrase, power magnifies impact. And I'm probably going to use that in lots of places. I really like that. Sarah, before you go, where can people find your book and what will they read about in your book?
You can find it in all good bookshops. So yeah, it's available via Amazon, via all the independents, so via Waterstones or Foyles or the other, other independent publishers, also via my publisher's website, Practical Inspiration Publishing. There is also a companion website, which is linked. It's on the book page of my own website, where you can download lots of companion resources and workbooks to work through the exercises. And that's really what it is a really practical guide to help you, firstly, understand your own micro interactions, understand the impact you might be having through what you say, what you listen to and how you listen and how you act. Which includes not only your habits, but your sort of all the non-verbal interactions and stuff we've touched on today, and then gives you a framework to start to say, well, okay, where does that not match the impact that I want to have? Where does that not match the leader I want to be? And what can I do about that? So it takes you through, again, lots of exercises, lots of ideas, lots of suggestions, lots of ways to think about it, so that whichever areas of your micro interactions might be your blind spot or might be the area that you want to work on, there's material for you to take and get out there and practice. That's really what the last part of the book does, is it draws that together and say, well, how do I make this, like, what do I do with all of this? Because, lots of ideas, but breaks it down into how you can practice it, how you can start to build consistency, and how you start to make this sort of sustainable for the long term, so that it's not just this was interesting for a few weeks, and then 4 weeks down the line you're going back to all of your old habits, which arguably might do more damage than if you hadn't changed anything at all. So it's intended to be really deeply practical and support and guide leaders through that journey. Amazing.
Well, I'm wondering, listeners, watchers, if you do my self-aware compass quiz before you read Sarah's book, follow the very practical examples that she shares, and then in 5-6 months' time, come back and do your self-awareness compass quiz and see what differences you find. Very interesting. Sarah, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been fascinating.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode, where we aim to develop self-aware leaders around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Head over to my website at knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk to sign up to my newsletter to keep up to date with my blog, podcast and book. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.